My name is Marcia Robinson, and we are recording an oral history with Helane Adams Androne as part of the Sweet MUMories Oral History Project. This project marks the 50th anniversary of the Miami University Middletown, Ohio campus. This interview is taking place on April 21st, 2017 at the Gardner-Harvey Library. Dr. Androne, do I have your consent to proceed with this interview?
Yes, you do.
Thank you. So can you tell us about how you came to be part of the faculty at Miami University?
Yes. So I came to Miami almost by accident. And I say that looking back, thinking that it certainly wasn't. I'm certainly glad I'm here, and it certainly wasn't, I don't think, an accident. But I didn't know anything about Miami. In fact, I never heard of Miami. As a West Coast transplant, you'd have to know that folks, I had my sights set on remaining on the West Coast. And so when jobs came up and I looked at the position description and I thought, first of all, why is this called Miami when it's in Ohio? And second of all, where is this place? I mean, I've never even heard of this place, and I don't know anyone in Ohio. I've known exactly one person from Ohio. And so I thought I'd ask around. So I asked my dissertation chair. She said, well, I have heard of Miami. I think it operates something like it's a public school, but I think it's kind of operates like an Ivy in some ways or something like that. And initially I was turned off by that because I wasn't necessarily looking for a place like the places I was familiar with. And so I ended up getting an interview because I did apply to the position. And I was on the edge of canceling the interview. I thought I'd made it sufficiently difficult to get me to get here. But so I came for the interview, and I will tell you that I hadn't even realized that Miami had regional campuses set up the way that it did. I didn't realize the relationship between the regional campuses, the main campus in Oxford, and the relationship within departments and among faculty, that it really is this one solid place, that the regional campuses have separate locations, but that in terms of faculty, in so many ways, we are one, right? So when I first got here, I was surprised. As I came on campus, and the first people I met were Jim Ewers, who used to be in administration on the Middletown campus, Tracy Davis, who worked with him, Darius Pryor, who also was a part of that administration, who's gone on now to his own position as a professor. I ended up mentoring him into that, showing my age. You cut that part. But anyway, so I met them, and they were so warm. I was introduced to so many staff and students, and it just was entirely the opposite of what I imagined. And I was looking for that sort of scenario. I was looking for something a little bit different. I wanted to work with students who were not necessarily the average traditional student. I was interested in working with students who maybe didn't make every right choice the first time round, or maybe had life happen while they were doing it, or came from communities where it just wasn't the norm. I just wanted something more interesting. I wanted something that looked more like the community that I'd come from. I recognized myself as that sort of person, though I was still a traditional student. I was non-traditional in the sense that I was coming from a different class and ethnic background than the vast majority of people I went to school with. So I was interested in being that person who was privileged enough to go to those kinds of schools and would work with kids like me, folks like me, in some way, shape, or form. So when I got to Miami, what I had heard about it was not what attracted me. What I was attracted to was what I saw when I got here. Because at the time I couldn't tell on the website what the differences really were, these campus differences. I really didn't know that it was open enrollment, et cetera, which I loved that idea. I feel like people who want to learn should be able to learn and to be able to have the opportunity to do that. And that their motivation should be what is the, that actually is the opportunity. It's just their motivation to learn, to be there, to pursue it, right? So I got here, it's a long story. So I got here, and after having interviewed away, but they brought me in, I met all these wonderful staff members, I met wonderful students, I saw the campuses, and I kind of fell in love a little. I fell in love a little bit. I really started to think about this place as someplace I could be. I stood out a little bit much because, I don't know, maybe the West Coast was dripping off of me at the time, because people kept asking me where I was from when I came here. But I just essentially fell in love with the place and its history from there, I suppose.
So what kept you here?
So what kept me here at Miami was the faculty and staff I work with, as much as it was the students I interacted with, have been interacting with all along. I would say I have had marvelous interactions with faculty here. I feel very much a part of the Department of English. I feel very much a part of the general feeling of faculty. This is a big place with a small feel, as far as I can tell. I know a lot of my colleagues pretty well. They're warm. They've been really kind about sharing their work, about mentoring. In particular, I've had two people in particular who have been really important to me. One of those people is Jeffrey Summers, and when I got here, he was just wonderful about asking me how I was doing, asking me about my courses and what I was doing in those courses, how I was doing what I was doing. He was also interested in working together as colleagues. I had never had someone actually approach me to say, let's do this thing together. Will you come into my class? Will you, and not just to share, but will you come into my class and to give me some feedback and to talk to my students about the projects they're working on and to see what they're doing and just to be a part of this larger study that I'm doing. So we ended up writing an article together, publishing together. I would also say that, actually there are a number of people who've been really important. I would say Mel Cohen has been important to me as well. And while we jibe each other about the fact that he's a political scientist, and as sad as that may be in English, we found ourselves on a number of committees together, and we would go head to head sometimes on things, but in a jovial kind of way. And it just ended up being this really good relationship. And ever since we met, I mean, he again was another person who asked me to come in. He was going to start doing something specific with students and faculty. He wanted to start having these conversations on campus. So he started the student faculty program and asked me to be a part of it, and I did. Ever since that program started, we pretty much meet for lunch every semester and talk. We met just recently. And just sit down and talk about what's going on in the world and what's going on at the university and how things are going with our work and all that sort of thing. But he's probably an example of someone with whom, you know, everything we do doesn't agree, but we find so many ways to talk to each other and to actually, we actually have quite a lot in common. And so I appreciate those two very much for who they've been professionally, and how they've helped sustain me professionally in some ways. They're not the only ones, but there are a couple of folks who did that for me here. Wow.
So you talked about the encouragement you received from your colleagues and sharing that opportunity to enter each other's classroom. Did that contribute in any way to the conversation that led to the CTL, the Center for Teaching and Learning?
I would say that it did. Well, part of that conversation about developing a Center for Teaching and Learning was that not only do we find it valuable to get together and talk about teaching, but Miami actually has a long tradition for this. The Lilly Conference emerges out of Miami University and has been around for a long time. And it now has a number of different conference locations. But I think all of us were really interested because we were generalists. You know, we were hired in our areas of specialty, but we also consider ourselves generalists in certain ways because we teach foundation courses. And because we do that, I think that it matters to us to be able to talk to each other about Miami Plan classes, to be able to talk to each other about processes like the development of assignments that have been standardized to some degree, particularly in English, because it was really English heavy. The design for the CTL was really a gathering of folks mostly out of English who wanted to have those conversations. Not to say that we were the only ones, but as I recall, we were. So wanting to talk about teaching, the fact that we were in fact publishing and thinking about teaching in professional ways. I have a master's in teaching English, entirely separate from the PhD, but I do not feel like study of teaching always gives you the same kind of opportunity that talking to each other about what's actually happening in the classroom. That is where you really learn how to teach. And so it's really valuable to talk to each other about best practices, to talk to each other about what and how do you do that thing? How do you handle discussion? How did you build that assignment or that project? What were the epic fails, you know, the tremendous challenges, especially in this environment where we have students that cross the gamut in terms of their level of preparation, in terms of their backgrounds, all of that, you know. What they have in common perhaps is their motivation, but generally speaking, we've got this swirling of possibilities that happen in the classroom. So how we teach any given semester could change based on the makeup of that class, which I think that variation makes it challenging and exciting at the same time. I like that. And I think that answers the question.
So some of the people who were involved in the CTL include Ellen Marie Walrab and John Tassoni. Can you talk about their contributions to the CTL?
Sure. So Ellen Marie Walrab, Ellen Marie Walrab contributed tremendously to the CTL. She was so deeply involved in thinking about pedagogy, so serious about how to help students learn. I found her to be so thoughtful and so important to the conversation about how we thought about where it would be, how open it would be, how it would serve students' needs. John Tassoni was also tremendously important to the CTL, and he continues to be tremendously important to the CTL. He is super thoughtful about practice and the nature, the sort of theoretical grounding and opportunities that happen in the classroom. And I could be getting this wrong, but I think that the combination of folks involved with that was a really sort of broad range of the general conversation about what we do when we teach. So thinking through the bigger questions, John was really good about problematizing things, and not in a way that was, distracting, but to really ask us to think about the principles we were considering and what was possible in the CTL. Ella Marie, as I recall, was really wonderful about the warmth of that space and about making it an open space for that conversation, a space that was welcoming, a space that was both smart and not intimidating.
All of this has been focused on teaching in a group of students, and as you said, you never know what the mix is going to be from one semester to another.
Right.
Can you give us an example of a student who's non-traditional and how that impacts on the classroom?
Absolutely. So one of the most memorable moments that I've had with a student was with a non-traditional student who was a veteran, probably in his mid-60s at the time. And the class makeup was a mixture, but there were certainly lots of traditional students. And then there was a segment of non-traditional students. And when I say non-traditional students, I mean that in several different ways. I think that there were folks in that classroom who were perhaps first generation. There were non-traditional students based on age. Some not far off the age of the traditional student, but still had maybe had work experience, were currently full-time employed. There were students in that class who had children at Miami. So there was this variety. But I remember a conversation that we had in class that was really interesting because the dynamic of the discussion would change when the interaction between these traditional and non-traditional students would happen. And one of those students, after this really wonderful dynamic conversation happened, came to me and said, Dr. A, I see things a little differently than some of the students in here. And I wasn't quite sure what he meant, except that he leaned in really close to me and he said, do you see what I mean? And as I'm looking at him, I realize that he has a prosthetic eye. And in the prosthetic eye, there's a pupil, and this pupil has a design. And he proceeded to tell me the various ways that he would change this design based on his mood, and how sometimes that mood would sort of guide and influence some of the conversations he would have. But what he was saying was that not only were there obvious ways in which he saw things differently than the students in the class based on his experience in the world, his experience with work, his experience in war, but also because of his experience with, this sort of change in ability, and how he had coped with that change in ability. And so it was fantastic, and it changed something for me, because I knew that already, but it just made visual and made obvious what I loved about being in that classroom space and what I love about being in Miami. And that is that all of those experiences are happening in the classroom at the same time, and that's unusual. That there would be privileged and less privileged, that there would be traditional and non-traditional, that there would be a variety of class and experience backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, language backgrounds, all happening in that classroom at the same time. He demonstrated that to me in that moment, and I was moved by it.
Some of our faculty have talked about how the students help them grow and help them teach, and you're leaning into that conversation now. How have the students changed the way you teach over the years? What have you learned from them?
I would say the students changed the way that I taught the moment I got here. And I would say that because I was transitioning into a new environment. There's always that. There's always the what you bring with you, and what you think you know about being in a classroom. Because I had taught before I got here as a graduate student, but I'll never forget, there was another colleague who said to me, you may want to take it easy a little bit, ease in, and, he was basically saying, assess the situation a little bit with regard to your student ability in the class and that sort of thing. And it was good advice. I took it in that moment as, be nice. Don't expect too much. It's a comment on preparation, and some of our students are less prepared than others. I immediately rejected that advice. I rejected that advice only because I felt a little bit like I am not going to take it easy on these students because I know they can do it. And I will help them. It will be more work for me, but I know they can do it. And I went into the classroom and I told them that. I told them what was said to me. I told them, I was told that I should take it easy on you all, that I shouldn't expect you to know certain things, etc. But I'm not. Now, it was hard for them, and I did, in fact, not take it easy on them, but it took work for me to change and scaffold things differently than I had before, because I did take the advice of assessing the situation. I knew what I was dealing with once, things got rolling. But I won't forget a student who came to me and said, and it was a composition class, beginning composition class, and I remember her saying, "This was just the hardest class I've ever had. And she said, but I feel like I've pushed myself, I've challenged myself, I feel like I can do this, I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm so glad you kicked my butt. And she stuck with it, and as I recall, she went into journalism. but it was really hard, and she was really a struggling writer. And she had a lot of discrimination against her, and she carried that baggage into the classroom. And I say that because she was from, deep Appalachia. She had a strong Kentucky accent, and it was used against her regularly in terms of how people perceived her intellectual capacity. And so I would constantly rail her about her writing, and that she could do this, and that she should be doing this, and that I wasn't going to ease up on her. And this is how you learn how to write in these ways that you want to write. And so she said, I think I'm thinking about journalism, and it's as if she waited for me to respond to that in some way that I didn't. And I think that was important to her. So some of these students, the way that we ended up interacting in the classroom, whether they were prepared or completely unprepared, it taught me something important, and that was that I had to measure and balance the scaffolding with the motivation, with really coaching and trying to help them understand that they were absolutely capable. And that I was not going to let them lean back on their previous baggage about what they could and couldn't do, or how smart they thought they were or weren't. That wasn't going to be their excuse. Giving up, something else, but it wasn't going to be because they weren't good enough.
I'm going to change tracks to something you said before. The faculty at the regionals tend to be generalist, but we still publish.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of support do you see at the regionals to keep the faculty current and up to date and publishing?
Well, there is the motivation for progressing in one's profession. I think that there are a number of mechanisms at Miami for supporting us in our publications, in our research, in the work and the questions we want to ask, the work we want to do. I have found that there is a relational support factor. And by that I mean there is access across the campuses to information, to funding support. There's support for conferencing, presenting one's work. There's absolutely been support for faculty research leaves, faculty improvement leaves. There are a number of ways that I think Miami has done a reasonable job of providing mechanisms for talking about teaching, as in the CTL, and all the centers for teaching excellence that exist on the campuses, the various conferences that Miami participates in and supports in the community. And I think, while I do think that Miami could do better in supporting more than just tenure track faculty, I think in terms of tenure track faculty that there are mechanisms there, and that there is support, and there are opportunities, as in the research presentations that happen every year, where faculty can come and talk about their current research and their current work and engage that way. I've presented in those forums before. But I think that there is a general understanding that while we are doing a lot of teaching, there is also this sense that that teaching needs to translate into a conversation with the public and with the profession. And I think that's extremely important, and I take that very seriously, because I always felt that sense of having one foot in academia and one foot in the translating of that for the people that I know, my family. And when your family asks you, so what is your dissertation about? You cannot go on and on about these theoretical concepts. You really do have to be in this ongoing discourse about what your work is about and how it matters. And I think there's a good atmosphere for doing that here.
I'd like to continue with the phrase, as it matters. How does the scholarship of faculty, the faculty's scholarly life, matter to our students? Why should the university invest in that scholarship?
First of all, I think that faculty scholarship matters to students because it affects what and how we teach. For example, in my work has developed from really sort of traditional literary analysis work into ritual studies. And that has translated into a pedagogical method. And so what began as sort of way of looking at American ethnic texts transitioned as I taught here at Miami into these other operations in the classroom, where I began to see, how can I make this work useful and matter in my classroom? And I discovered that this is the ground. I mean, this is where it has to matter. It can't just be talking about texts only with people who want to talk about those particular texts. But how can I make that matter to students who are not going into English or literature or anything like that? And so it happened that I was able to say, I need to use this work in a structural way as well, as I'm arguing in my research that it can be done. So I developed a pedagogical method that was based on, or founded in ritual studies and performance studies. And I used it to teach writing and to help students access their own texts. And it was really successful. And I've taken bits of that and used it and helped other students to use it. So for example, in capstone courses, I've taught the concepts around ritual and ritual studies to help students who are transitioning out of the university to think about the cultures they were transitioning into, because the principles are the same. So by that I mean that in the classroom, when we could talk about these are the things that we do that are sacred. These are the things that matter to us. This is how we make those things public. And while it may not immediately seem as though that would matter to, say, someone who's going into the banking industry or someone who's going into science, et cetera, it really does. Because what I did was I sent them on a sort of ethnographic trip into those spaces once we'd had some conversation, and asked them to observe those spaces from that perspective. And what they did was they came back with really important information about what difference they could make and how they could make a difference, and how long it would take for them to make a difference in that space, based on what they saw was sacred in that space and who were the players in that space to speak to. So in that way, I think that faculty scholarship, faculty research, faculty work, and the teaching needs to intersect. And it does in that classroom space. And so it becomes really important that what we do out there matters in here, and what we do in here matters out there.
I'd like to continue talking about the space between campus and the public. And there's an aspect of that public connection that you do, of bringing the humanities off campus, and that would be the Ohio Writing Project. Can you describe that project to us?
Sure. I was involved with the Ohio Writing Project, which is a site of the National Writing Project, for several years prior to becoming the director of the Ohio Writing Project for 4.5 years. I was actually introduced to the Ohio Writing Project by Jeffrey Summers, a colleague of mine here at Middletown. So I ended up taking on a class for Jeff because he needed to be away that summer. And I got the opportunity to co-teach with a K-12 teacher. It was fantastic. I enjoyed it very much. And from there, I never stepped away from it. The Ohio Writing Project is, as I said, a site of the National Writing Project, which means it seeks to bring educators together across levels to talk about the teaching of writing and about literacies, disciplinary literacies, but particularly, talking about the pedagogies associated with writing. And so there are a couple of different arms to what happens through a writing project, but I will say this about how that project interacts with the public. So the Ohio Writing Project draws K-12 teachers from throughout the region, and we draw teachers from as far north as Cleveland, as far south into Kentucky, and east and west. Teachers from all over the region. The Ohio Writing Project has touched more than 100,000 teachers in this region since it began in 1980. It promotes professional development for K-12 teachers, but there is also, since 2002, there's also been a master's in teaching offered through the Ohio, completely administered by the Ohio Writing Project. Now, what I think is really important about some of that work in terms of the public is that this is a space within which the conversation about teaching writing has been transformative to me. It's something like what happens in a conference space, but we're not segmented in the way that we traditionally are. We are together across levels. So K through 12, higher ed, we are together. It's a co-teaching model where a professor is instructing alongside a K through 12 teacher in order to facilitate a process of thinking about the teaching of writing, of thinking about how we do this thing, what are the best practices that we use in our classrooms, what are our challenges, and how do we approach those challenges as professionals together. This is not a space where one group is telling another group what should and shouldn't happen in a classroom, or how do I prepare for this group, or et cetera. It's really a space of exchange. And it's an opportunity for teachers to write, to discover themselves as writers once again, because the underlying principle is also, how can you teach students to write if you don't write? So how can you ask students to do things that you aren't practicing? So we, as instructors of writing, get together and we talk about how to do that. And it provides a space for doing that. And so I would love to see that kind of exchange happening regularly. I would love to see us thinking about the humanities broadly in that way, disciplinary literacies in that way, where instructors are talking about what it means to learn and teach in those disciplines, not only the content of those disciplines, but the way that we disseminate that information. How do we communicate our knowledges outside of our disciplinary circles and even inside our disciplinary circles? And so, to that end, I would love to see, support of that. I would love to see us I would love to see us able to constructively have those conversations and maybe even have a space for doing that really regularly at the regionals. Something like what happens in Oxford at the Howe Center for Writing Excellence, where you have donors who have actually said, writing is important to every industry. Communicating is important across disciplines, and we're going to support that effort. I would love to see that kind of support of writing and literacy happening at the regionals, where we can have a space and programming that supports faculty thinking seriously about assignment construction, how to best communicate with students, setting aside time to write, boot camping, as it were, that, writing boot camp, the opportunity to just get into a space uninterrupted, not distracted, and committed to writing, whether that's creative or academic writing, but to finish projects in that space. So writing boot camps are especially important to faculty work. I myself am a huge proponent of these kinds of boot camps because they changed my ability to complete my work. We are teaching a lot of classes, and it's really difficult to find the space to do the kind of thinking and writing that it takes to progress in our disciplines and in our professions. And so I found that going to writing boot camps, and I usually had to travel to do that, but going to writing boot camps meant that I could set aside that time to just work on those projects. It meant that all the difference in the world for finishing my books, for finishing my articles. I do not think I could have done that in the time that I did it without those writing boot camps and getting some sort of support to be able to set that time aside to be able to write. It was invaluable. I have never written as much as I have in a day doing writing boot camps. And I should probably say that that's one of the reasons I was able to get 2 books out within probably that same amount of, within as many years, which is almost kind of unheard of because those projects progressed largely because I was able to participate in faculty writing boot camps. And that meant a lot to my own progress in my profession.
Often students talk about the quality of instructors here at the campus, and you've given us examples of how our faculty may be generalists, but are definitely active in their profession as scholars. Now I'd like to do a little time travel.
Oh boy.
Back to the time when you started. I believe our director was Dr. Gavin Auntie?
Yes.
All right. Did you get a sense of that culture of scholarship and teaching during Dr. Gavin Auntie's time? And can you give us any sense of how you saw that, and did Dr. Gavin Auntie do anything to set the pace for that?
I want to say that during Dr. Gavin Auntie's time, well, first of all, I believe that I came in toward the end of Dr. Gavin Auntie's time. But there were supports in place that I imagine were the result of his supporting faculty. I mean, I would say those came in the form of faculty leaves and research leaves and those kinds of things, and how that competition was handled. That's probably all I've got for Gavin Auntie.
Okay.
I don't recall as much. You are asking for a time travel.
And we don't have to take that journey.
Right.
We don't have to.
I'm trying to think. When did he leave?
I can't tell you the year.
Okay. Because I feel like it was in '02 or '03. I'm trying to remember.
And we don't have to.
Right.
We don't have to follow this thread. I was just wondering. And we can move on to something else. Do you recall the atmosphere on campus when there was a discussion about how to restructure the relationship between the regionals and the Oxford campus and what it meant to the students? And do you have anything you'd like to say about what you saw during that time and how things resolved?
I do recall when a number of years ago, when the conversations were happening, what I understand the conversations were happening again with regard to the structure of the regional campuses. I believe that conversation began before my time. And so I think it had been a much longer cycle. But when those conversations were happening in my time here, or in my first experiences with them, I know there was a great deal of trepidation. I know that students were really nervous. They were really concerned. And I was also a little bit concerned for different reasons. I think student concerns were couched in the perception of their experience at the regionals and how further separation would affect that perception. Lots of our students have struggled with their difference from Oxford students. They have struggled with just how they're perceived in Oxford. And lots of them preferred to be at the regionals. They preferred to be able to have the sort of course sizes, the warmth, the feeling that they got in our courses. They enjoyed not feeling different in the sense that there is a sort of well-established culture, and then there's you. But here, because there is so much difference already happening, there are a number of non-traditional, traditional, veterans, parents, business people, all kinds of folks in any given classroom. It tends to melt away some of the difference issues while the difference is still there. But it can be treated differently. So when the conversation about restructuring was happening again, I think there was concern that once again there would be this feeling that we're different. And by different, that would automatically translate into not as good as the main campus, etc. Now, for all intents and purposes, we understand that our faculty, more and more, and I'd say almost entirely my time here, we hire PhDs. We hire faculty who are publishing, who are extraordinary. And so in that regard, the concerns about the kind of education that they're getting aren't as serious in my mind. But the perception was a concern. Now, as those conversations progressed and we asked a lot of questions about what did that mean, what did that mean even in the logistical sense? What did that mean with regard to what the degree would say? What did that mean in terms of what we would be called? How would we be able to identify ourselves or make decisions for regional students who are in fact different than students on the main campus in certain ways, for all the reasons that I've said, a sort of non-traditional setting. Now, we've got more and more traditional students. I'm not suggesting that they aren't here, but the mixture is what I mean. So I guess I'm suggesting that there were fears, and a lot of the faculty were concerned about the same things because we are concerned about our students and their perception. We're also concerned about the kind of faculty we might attract if suddenly it was perceived that we were not who we had been, that we were perceived as not being a part of who Miami is and what Miami's goals and principles are. So there were concerns, and I would say the atmosphere was strained because of that. I think as time has gone on, there have been arguments, I think, on both ends of the structuring conversations that have been both, some positive, pros and cons, where it's really good to be able to, for example, have some say about how your marketing can happen, because we have population differences. And so it's marvelous to be able to speak to our audience specifically and not have to use the exact same strategies. We need to be able to speak to our community specifically. We need to be able to feature people who attract, our particular audience. And I think that's a wonderful thing. And I think now we are still going through growing pains. We're still trying to articulate that, who we are to the community. I think it's wonderful that we are pushing forward on the idea that we have one Miami. We are still that one place, and that we can conceive of one place that is distributed and has multiple audiences. In the same way that other campuses have done that. So I think the conversation about restructuring has been difficult and a process and lots of questions, and we're still moving through how that's developing. But now we're in a space where we've got something like 17 degrees offered, beginning to end at the regionals. We are steadily marketing ourselves as One Miami. We still have growing pains with trying to figure out what that means precisely in some cases. But lots of our departments are figuring that out and figuring out ways of both retaining a regional identity, but also being able to remain a part of the larger Miami identity.
And with that, I would like to know, what is it that you would like to say to faculty who are hired 5 or 10 years from now? What should they think about when joining the culture of MUM?
So I think faculty who are coming in to Middletown should understand why they're here, should have a really strong sense of purpose and clarity about who they want to serve here. I think that there are a number of ways to give in this campus. There are so many ways to serve the students here and to serve the faculty here. And it's very much a warm environment. People do know each other. The faculty do interact well with each other. There is a vibe at MUM that's kind of familial. And so that I think I like very much. And I think anyone who's coming here ought to know that that's what you're coming into. You're kind of coming into a space where the expectation is that you'll interact in this family. The expectation is that you will engage with staff and with faculty and with students and the community, and that the community is going to know who you are, and they're going to appreciate what you're doing, and that the students are going to rely on you for more than just the academic work. They're going to need to see who you are and how you are in the world and in your profession, because many of them haven't seen that before. I have had students say to me, I had never thought about the possibility of being a professor because I'd never seen anyone as a human who was doing that, you know, as someone who seemed like they cared, as someone who seemed interested and interested in their success and interested in making sure they get it and that they succeed in a variety of ways, who spent the time talking about what that means and exploring things with them. So I'm hoping that anyone else who comes in recognizes that, upholds that legacy, takes that seriously.
The last question. The committee that planned this campus wanted a place of opportunity. Did that happen, and what would you say to the committee?
I would say to the committee who planned these campuses, thank you. I would say that it changed my life. It really provided a space I wasn't sure existed. It provides this beautiful combination that I was looking for between some of the distinct privileges of a larger university with the really important goals and opportunities and I guess strategic plans that are built around the community. And it does that thing that I imagine should happen between big giant university and community college. But it's doing something that's not either of those. It's doing both. And that, I would say, was very brilliant and wonderful of them to do. Because of the positionality of our campuses and the planning of that positionality, it creates a unique scenario. There are other campuses that have regional campuses, other universities that have regional campuses, but we're all in the same county, and that is unique, I think. That sets up a situation that can sustain the idea of one Miami. It's because of that planning. It's because these separate communities are so close that, and yet different. They're all very different, that you can set up this idea of one Miami, and that can make sense in a different way. So I would say thank you. I would say well done.